Hello, I am glad you are here. Take a moment to settle in, breathe softly, and let your mind become calm. What follows is a gentle unfolding of history, told slowly and steadily, like a quiet tide coming to shore. Tonight we will drift back more than 7 centuries, to an age of warriors, distant emperors, and a storm so powerful that it shaped the fate of a nation. Let the soft rhythm of the story help you rest, as we begin the tale of how a storm saved Japan from the Mongols in the year 1281. In those distant days, the islands we now call Japan were a tapestry of mountains, forests, mist, and villages that clung to the coastline. Life moved in cycles of rice planting and harvest, of fishing tides and changing seasons. The sound of wooden sandals on packed earth, the creak of ox carts, and the quiet rituals of temples filled the days of common people. Above them stood the warrior class, the samurai, disciplined and bound to their lords through oaths of loyalty. And above the samurai stood the shogunate, a military government that guided the land while the emperor lived largely in ceremonial stillness. The sunrise of each day glowed over fields of ripening rice and over the Bay of Hakata, a place destined to become the stage for a moment of history that would echo far beyond its shores. But before the storm that would one day be called divine swept over those waters, there was another world across the sea, a world ruled by an empire so vast that its borders touched deserts, mountains, and rivers thousands of miles apart. That empire belonged to the Mongols. They had risen from the wide grasslands of the steppe under a leader who united the clans with vision and relentless drive. His name was Temujin, but the world remembers him as Genghis Khan. After his death, his descendants continued to expand the empire with determination. Among them was his grandson Kublai Khan, a man who ruled from the city we now know as Beijing. Kublai sought to extend his influence and saw Japan as a land that should recognize his authority. When Japan refused, the seeds of conflict were sown. But before the storm, before the vast armada, and before the clash of two worlds, there were many smaller moments and decisions that formed the path leading to that fateful year. The quiet conversations in court chambers, the distant letters carried by messengers across seas, the worries of farmers and fishermen, and the sharpening of swords by samurai who sensed danger on the horizon, all shaped the events to come. As the story unfolds, we will walk through these moments gently, step by step. We will see how winds turn the course of history, how courage and uncertainty existed side by side, and how the people of the 13th century lived through times that would become legend. Let us begin where the tension first took root, in the years before Kublai Khan sent his mighty fleets across the sea. At that time, Japan was governed by the Kamakura shogunate, a military government headquartered far from the imperial court in Kyoto. The emperor still existed, but his role was largely symbolic. Real power rested with the shogun and the clan that supported him. The Minamoto clan had founded the shogunate, but by the time of Kublai Khan's rise, it was the Hojo regents who held the reins of authority. The Hojo family governed with a firm sense of duty, aware of the fragile balance required to maintain order among the warrior families. Their world was shaped by discipline and vigilance, yet none among them could have imagined the enormous force that would one day sail toward their shores. When the first letter arrived from the Mongol court, written in formal script and carried across the sea to demand that Japan acknowledge Mongol supremacy, it must have seemed distant and almost unreal. But as envoy after envoy brought similar demands, the reality of looming conflict became impossible to ignore. The first Mongol invasion came in 1274, a fierce and sudden assault that shocked the samurai. They had long fought one another in battles governed by certain customs, where warriors announced themselves before combat and engaged in duels. The Mongol way of war was different. They fought as a unified force, used coordinated tactics, thunderous drums, and weapons unfamiliar to the Japanese. The clash left deep impressions, and although the Mongols were forced to retreat, the memory of their strength lingered. Years passed, but the Mongols did not forget Japan. Kublai Khan prepared a second invasion, far larger and more formidable than the first. Across the sea, the people of Japan sensed the gathering storm. Samurai practiced with bow and blade. Workers built fortifications along the coast of Kyushu. Monks prayed for protection. Fishermen watched the horizon with unease. Everyone knew that something vast was coming, though no one could guess that a storm would shape everything. And now, as we stand on the threshold of the second invasion, the story deepens. This is where the Great Armada begins to form in the harbors of Korea and China. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, the largest fleet the world had ever seen. Their sails caught the wind of destiny, and their prows pointed toward Japan. As the Great Armada formed in the harbors of Korea and China, the scale of the undertaking became clear. Workers loaded supplies onto ships for days at a time, stacking grain, barrels of water, bundles of weapons and armor. Horses were guided up ramps onto transports built specifically to hold them. Soldiers received orders from their commanders and prepared for the long voyage ahead. The fleet was not made of a single group, but a mixture of Mongol, Chinese, and Korean forces brought together under the authority of Kublai Khan. Each group had its own customs, languages, and ways of organizing, yet they were expected to act as a unified whole. Reports of this activity eventually reached Japan. Messengers traveled from Kyushu to Kamakura, carrying news about the scale of the preparations. When the shogunate heard that this new invasion force was larger than the first, concerns spread through the court. The regents understood that even though the previous invasion had been repelled, the Mongol Empire remained a powerful opponent. Japan had no experience facing a force of such size more than once. Yet the shogunate had spent the intervening years taking what measures it could. Defensive walls had been built along much of the coastline of Hakata Bay. These walls were not tall, but they formed a strong barrier, intended to prevent enemy ships from landing easily. Life in Japan during these months was shaped by waiting. Fishermen continued to cast their nets, farmers tended their fields, and children played in the dirt roads of their villages, but everyone felt the tension. Samurai spent many hours practicing with bow and spear. Armor was inspected and repaired. Horses were kept ready. Buddhist monks held ceremonies, chanting for the safety of the islands. Shinto shrines received visitors who prayed for peace and for protection from whatever forces might threaten the land. On the wide waters between the continents, the Mongol fleet gathered into large groups. Ships filled the horizon, and the sound of oars and rigging carried across the sea. The soldiers aboard these vessels had been told that Japan would resist, and many among them remembered stories of the first failed invasion. Some were eager for battle, while others felt less confident. They had been at sea before and knew that long voyages brought difficulties. Navigation was not always precise. Storms could appear without warning. Supplies could run thin. Even so, orders had been given, and the fleet pressed onward. The months leading up to the invasion moved slowly. For the people of Japan, the delay was both a relief and a strain. Every day without an attack allowed more preparation, yet it also extended the period of uncertainty. The defensive walls along Hakata Bay grew more familiar to those who lived nearby. Samurai were stationed on watch. Small boats patrolled the shoreline. When evening fell, torches flickered along the coast as lookouts kept their eyes on the darkening sea. Villagers living near the shore sometimes climbed small hills or walked to the water's edge, uncertain whether they would see the fleet arrive. The shogunate issued instructions to regional lords, reminding them of their responsibilities. Supplies needed to be stored. Horses had to be maintained in good condition. Warriors had to be ready to move quickly if a large force landed anywhere on Kyushu. Japan lacked a centralized naval force. So much of the defensive effort depended on coordination and vigilance. These preparations were not dramatic, but they reflected the practical reality of the moment. The leadership of the shogunate understood that survival depended on steady, organized effort rather than grand gestures. Across the sea, the Mongol commanders discussed their plans. They aimed to overwhelm Japanese defenses by landing in multiple locations, forcing the defenders to split their forces. They believed that their superior numbers would eventually secure victory. The soldiers under their command were experienced in siege warfare, cavalry charges, and coordinated formations. Yet they were not as familiar with the waters of the region. The seas around Japan were sometimes unpredictable, with currents and weather patterns that could shift quickly. As the fleet advanced, the distance between the two worlds shrank. The people of Japan watched the horizon, and the Mongol armada drew steadily closer. The calm before the confrontation was long and uneasy, but it soon became clear that the second invasion was finally underway. Ships began appearing on the outer waters near Kyushu, their sails visible from shore. The alarm spread quickly. Messengers rode through the countryside alerting the samurai. Lookouts lit signal fires. Families gathered their belongings and moved inland, leaving the coast to the warriors. The Mongol forces attempted to approach Hakata Bay, but the defensive walls made landing difficult. Japanese ships, though smaller and fewer, harassed the enemy at night, attacking isolated vessels and boarding them in quick strikes. These engagements were chaotic and close, fought in the darkness with shouts, clashing weapons, and the sound of waves striking the sides of the ships. The Japanese used these tactics to slow the Mongol advance. They could not defeat the entire fleet this way, but they could prevent the enemy from securing an easy foothold. As days passed, the Mongol commanders grew frustrated. The fleet needed a stable landing site, but the defenses built by the Japanese made this difficult. The soldiers aboard the ships grew tired of waiting on the water. Supplies were consumed steadily. Horses confined below deck became restless. Tension increased among the officers. They had expected resistance, but not a prolonged delay at sea. The winds, which had been steady, began to shift. Clouds gathered in the distance. At first the change seemed minor, just a sign of typical summer weather. But gradually the sky darkened and the surface of the sea grew uneven. The Mongol commanders recognized that a storm might be forming, yet their fleet was already positioned near the coast. Conditions made it hard to move quickly. This is the point where the story approaches its central theme, though we will continue to reveal it gradually as events unfold. The Mongols remained on the water, the Japanese held their fortified coast, and the weather grew increasingly unstable. The darkening sky and growing wind over Hakata Bay marked the approach of a force that neither the Japanese defenders nor the Mongol commanders fully understood. For weeks, the Japanese had observed the Mongol fleet offshore, the glimmer of distant sails rising and falling with the waves, and had prepared themselves in quiet, methodical ways. Farmers continued to tend their crops inland, but many families had moved to safer locations, leaving the coastal villages mostly empty. The samurai kept vigilant watch along the defensive walls, sometimes climbing to the top to look out over the grey water. Even the monks, who were accustomed to relying on spiritual practice for protection, understood that this was a challenge requiring practical action as well. On the ships of the Mongol fleet, the soldiers and sailors faced mounting difficulties. Maintaining order among tens of thousands of men, along with hundreds of horses and an immense amount of supplies, proved complicated. The vessels themselves were crowded and heavy, constructed to carry men and materials in a way that was functional but not comfortable. The Mongol commanders tried to maintain discipline and morale, but small skirmishes among the troops, frustration from the cramped quarters, and fear of the unpredictable sea made the task arduous. The largest ships were designed to carry several hundred men and multiple horses, but the stability of such vessels was limited when strong winds or currents arose. The Japanese strategy relied largely on the coastal fortifications. The walls along Hakata Bay were not tall enough to stop an army outright, but they were sufficient to prevent a large-scale landing. Samurai stationed behind the walls used bows and spears, ready to strike at any ships that attempted to approach too closely. Small boats operated by local fishermen and trained warriors harassed isolated enemy vessels at night, boarding them when possible and retreating before larger forces could respond. Each day, the defenders reported on the fleet's movements, sending word along the coast so that every samurai company could remain coordinated. As the fleet waited offshore, the weather began to deteriorate. Clouds thickened, wind direction changed unpredictably, and the water around the anchored ships became increasingly rough. Storms were not unusual in these waters, especially during late summer, but the Mongols had not accounted for the sudden intensity of this one. The commanders debated whether to attempt an immediate landing or to wait for calmer conditions, but the shifting weather created uncertainty. The Japanese, meanwhile, watched from behind their fortifications, noting the uneasy motion of the fleet and preparing for the possibility that the storm itself could aid their defensive position. The fleet had reached its largest size in history for this campaign. Tens of thousands of men, perhaps over 100,000, were aboard thousands of ships. Each vessel was loaded with soldiers, armor, weapons, supplies, and animals. Coordination was challenging even under calm conditions, and in the face of a developing storm, the risk to the fleet grew. Anchors were dropped to prevent ships from drifting into one another, but the wind and waves were already beginning to strain the anchors and the hulls. In some cases, ropes snapped, and smaller ships collided with larger ones. The sea, which had seemed flat and predictable only days before, became a variable that even the most disciplined armies could not fully control. On land, the Japanese continued their preparations. The samurai stationed on the walls understood that their strength lay not only in direct combat, but in endurance. They checked their weapons, reinforced weak points along the walls, and kept watch through the nights. Scouts traveled along the coastline to ensure that no landing could occur at points distant from the main fortifications without warning. Supplies such as water, rice, and other essentials were stockpiled behind the walls, and messengers maintained constant communication with nearby villages and outposts. The shogunate oversaw the overall strategy, but much of the day-to-day vigilance fell to local leaders and experienced warriors who knew the land and the sea intimately. As the storm intensified, the Mongol commanders realized the danger. Ships began to shift with the waves. Many of the larger vessels, which had been designed to be stable, pitched violently, while smaller craft were tossed from side to side. Horses became increasingly anxious, sometimes panicking and injuring themselves or others. Soldiers struggled to maintain their balance on the decks, often losing equipment or being swept into the water. The fleet's cohesion began to break down as the storm continued, and communication between ships became almost impossible. The disciplined formations that had been the hallmark of Mongol military planning were now rendered ineffective by the natural force they faced. The timing and intensity of the storm were critical. Had the fleet reached Japan at a different moment, the defenders might have been forced to engage in direct combat on the shore, leading to significant casualties on both sides. Instead, the storm prevented a large-scale landing, scattering ships along the coast. Some were driven into shallow waters and ran aground. Others capsized under the combined force of waves and wind. Supplies were lost overboard, and soldiers were thrown into the sea. Many drowned, unable to reach the safety of land. Horses that survived were often stranded or swept away. The fleet, which had been the largest and most formidable force ever assembled to that point, was rendered largely ineffective by the storm. The Japanese defenders were aware of the storm's impact, but did not rely solely on it for protection. They continued their watch, understanding that even a reduced enemy could still cause harm if allowed to regroup. Small-scale engagements occurred when isolated ships or groups of soldiers attempted to reach the shore. but in most cases, the storm itself prevented these attempts from succeeding. Samurai reported the condition of the enemy, noting the loss of ships and men, while local villagers were instructed to remain behind the defensive walls and avoid exposure to the dangerous seas. This event, which would later be remembered as the intervention of the divine wind, was not instantaneous. It unfolded over several days, with the storm repeatedly striking different parts of the fleet. Strong gusts, heavy rains, and rough seas combined to create conditions that no human planning could overcome. The Mongol commanders attempted to regroup, moving their remaining ships to more sheltered positions, but the persistent wind and waves prevented effective maneuvering. The loss of cohesion and the constant danger of capsizing made any organized landing impossible. In the days following the storm, the Mongol forces began to withdraw. Many of the surviving ships were damaged and needed repair. Supplies had been lost, and morale among the troops was low. Commanders assessed the situation and concluded that further attempts at immediate invasion were not feasible. They returned to their ports, leaving Japan largely untouched by direct combat. The scale of the disaster for the invaders was enormous, with thousands of soldiers lost, hundreds of ships destroyed, and plans for conquest temporarily halted. For Japan, the event had significant consequences beyond the immediate survival of the islands. The defensive preparations made in advance proved effective when combined with the natural obstacle of the storm. Samurai gained experience in coordinated defense and in adapting to unpredictable circumstances. The population, while anxious during the invasion, witnessed the effectiveness of preparation and vigilance. The ruling shogunate reinforced the importance of maintaining readiness along the coast and managing resources efficiently. The Mongols, for their part, were forced to reconsider their strategy. Kublai Khan had intended to extend his empire into Japan, but the repeated failures, logistical difficulties, and the impact of natural forces revealed the limitations of even the largest armies. While plans for future invasions were considered, the combination of defensive resistance and environmental conditions made any attempt highly uncertain. The empire continued to expand in other directions, but Japan remained independent and largely untouched by foreign conquest. The historical significance of the storm lies in its timing, scale, and impact on both sides. It demonstrated the vulnerability of human plans to natural forces and highlighted the importance of preparation, local knowledge, and resilience. For Japan, the event reinforced national identity and the role of the samurai as defenders of the land. For the Mongols, it marked a rare and striking failure in an otherwise largely successful campaign of expansion. Even after the storm, memories of the invasion remained vivid. Samurai and local leaders told stories of the fleet that had appeared on the horizon, the wind and waves that scattered it, and the hours spent watching and waiting on the defensive walls. Generations remembered the event not only as a military encounter, but as a turning point in the survival and independence of Japan. Religious and cultural interpretations grew around the story, emphasizing the idea that protection came from forces beyond human control, and it became a part of the collective memory of the islands. In practical terms, the Kamakura shogunate continued to strengthen defenses along the coastline, maintaining walls, lookout posts, and rapid communication systems. Military drills and training became routine, and regional lords were expected to remain alert to potential threats from across the sea. Japan's isolation from continental conflicts was reinforced, but the lessons learned from the Mongol invasions influenced policy, military organization, and strategy for decades. The 1281 invasion, interrupted and effectively ended by the storm, illustrates a convergence of human planning, environmental conditions, and historical consequence. Neither side could fully control the outcome, but the preparedness of the Japanese and the timing of the storm combined to preserve the islands from conquest. The event became a reference point for understanding the interplay of natural forces and military strategy, and it contributed to the shaping of Japan's medieval society. Even today, historians examine the Mongol invasions of Japan as a case study in logistics, naval warfare, and the unpredictable influence of weather on human affairs. The combination of a large, well-organized force with inadequate knowledge of local conditions and the resilience of a smaller defending population highlights lessons that extend beyond the historical moment. The events of 1281 show how preparation, observation, and adaptation to environmental factors can be as decisive as numbers or technology in determining the outcome of conflict. The storm that disrupted the Mongol fleet was not merely a momentary event. It was the culmination of months of preparation, movement, and tension across two continents. It reshaped strategy, altered lives, and became a defining episode in the history of Japan. Samurai who survived the encounter went on to serve in subsequent conflicts, always carrying the memory of the largest invasion ever attempted against their homeland. Villages that had been on the coastline were rebuilt, and communities integrated lessons learned about emergency preparedness, local knowledge, and the importance of coordinated defense. After the storm had dispersed the Mongol fleet and forced the retreat of the surviving forces, Japan entered a period of careful reflection and consolidation. The immediate danger had passed, but the lessons of the invasion were far from forgotten. The Kamakura shogunate, which had overseen the defense of the islands, recognized that the scale and intensity of the attack had been unprecedented. Though the weather had been decisive in preventing a landing, the Japanese leaders understood that their preparation and vigilance had played an equally critical role. Defensive walls, watchtowers, trained samurai, and organized local militias had slowed and harassed the enemy, ensuring that even the storm could not have delivered complete protection without human effort complementing it. In the months following the retreat, officials traveled along the coastline to assess the damage caused by the fleet's arrival and the storm itself. Some villages had been affected by high waves, with docks and small structures washed away. In other areas, debris from the Mongol ships, such as broken masts, weaponry, and supplies, had drifted ashore. These remnants were collected, repaired, or repurposed by local communities. Artisans salvaged wood and metal, while the military examined the enemy armor and weapons, incorporating any innovations they found into local practices. The experience of handling these materials provided practical knowledge for future defenses, even though another invasion might never occur. The samurai who had witnessed the invasion firsthand returned to their lords and families, often bringing stories that detailed both the planning and the chaos of the Mongol attempt. Their accounts emphasized not only the threat posed by a foreign power, but also the resilience required to defend the homeland under unpredictable circumstances. These reports were formalized in records that would later become part of the historical memory of the period. Officials documented troop movements, supply management, and the outcomes of skirmishes along the coast. These records were meant to guide future generations in understanding both the strategies that had succeeded and the vulnerabilities that remained. Strategically, the shogunate took the storm as a confirmation of the importance of preparedness. Fortifications along the coast were strengthened further, with walls rebuilt higher, ditches widened, and guard rotations standardized. Local samurai were encouraged to maintain constant readiness, even in times of apparent peace. The government also invested in better communication networks, including relay posts for messengers who could report enemy movements or approaching weather quickly. Lessons learned from the logistical failures of the Mongols, their reliance on large fleets, long supply lines, and the vulnerability of ships to sudden storms, were analyzed carefully, shaping the Japanese approach to both military and civic planning. Beyond the military considerations, the invasion had significant psychological and cultural effects. People who had experienced the weeks of tension and the near approach of disaster carried memories of vigilance and uncertainty, Stories of the storm's timing and its destruction of the Mongol fleet became central to local oral histories. These accounts emphasized that, even in the absence of combat, the effort and readiness of the defenders had been essential. The event encouraged a sense of collective responsibility among communities, reinforcing the idea that both local leadership and ordinary people played roles in safeguarding the islands. Religious and spiritual interpretations of the event also grew, though these were more a matter of reflection than public ceremony. Shrines along the western coast of Kyushu became associated with the defense of the nation, and prayers for protection in times of crisis became more common. Buddhist monks and Shinto priests framed the storm as a moment of divine intervention, emphasizing the intersection of human effort and natural forces. However, this interpretation did not diminish the practical measures that had been taken. It complemented them, reinforcing the importance of discipline, planning, and vigilance alongside spiritual observance. In the larger context of Japanese politics, the invasion and its aftermath solidified the authority of the Kamakura shogunate, the government's ability to organize coastal defenses, direct local lords, and maintain order in the face of a foreign threat enhanced its legitimacy. Leaders emphasized the necessity of unity, coordination, and adherence to central directives, using the memory of the Mongol invasions as evidence of the importance of structured governance. Regional lords who had resisted the call for participation in defenses were reminded of the stakes, ensuring that military readiness became a standard expectation for all branches of the warrior class. The Mongols, meanwhile, returned to their own territories with a combination of frustration and reflection. Kublai Khan had invested enormous resources in the campaign, and the scale of the losses, both human and material, was substantial. Many soldiers drowned or were lost to injury, and ships were irreparably damaged. Supplies intended for the invasion were destroyed or abandoned, and the coordination between the various contingents, Chinese, Korean, and Mongol, had been severely disrupted. Commanders documented the difficulties they had encountered, noting both the challenges of long-distance naval campaigns and the dangers posed by natural phenomena. The failure of the 1281 invasion underscored the limits of the empire's expansion when confronting not only the enemy but also environmental conditions beyond control. Kublai Khan's advisors debated subsequent strategies, considering whether Japan could be targeted again in the future or whether resources would be better applied elsewhere. The combination of the Japanese defensive preparations and the natural disaster made further invasion attempts seem increasingly uncertain. Instead, the Mongols shifted focus toward other parts of East Asia, where logistical challenges were more manageable and opportunities for expansion remained favorable. The event marked one of the rare failures in an otherwise largely successful expansionist period, leaving a historical record of how even a powerful empire could be checked by both strategy and circumstance. For Japanese society, the long-term consequences of the invasion were profound. The experience prompted a re-evaluation of military organization, logistics, and the role of local communities in national defense. Defensive walls along the coast were maintained for decades, and coastal patrols became a regular aspect of samurai duty. Training exercises and strategic planning were institutionalized, ensuring that knowledge gained during the crisis was preserved. The perception of the samurai as both warriors and protectors of the land was strengthened, shaping the social and political hierarchy for generations to come. Cultural memory of the event grew steadily over time. Stories were told in villages and courts, emphasizing both the magnitude of the threat and the role of preparation in survival. The term Kamikaze, or divine wind, would later emerge in historical texts to describe the storm that had dispersed the Mongol fleet. This term conveyed both the destructive power of the storm and its significance in preserving Japan's independence. While the language had spiritual connotations, It also reflected a recognition of the interplay between human action and environmental conditions in shaping historical outcomes. The preservation of Japan during the Mongol invasions contributed to the continuity of political structures, cultural practices, and social organization. Had the invasion succeeded, the islands might have experienced foreign domination, disrupting local governance, cultural development, and social cohesion. The failure of the Mongols allowed the Kamakura shogunate to continue its rule, ensuring that Japan's feudal system, warrior culture, and administrative institutions remained intact. The experience also influenced later military thought, emphasizing the importance of preparedness, flexible response, and adaptation to unpredictable conditions. Trade, agriculture, and local economies, which had been temporarily disrupted during the invasion, gradually returned to normal. Villages and towns rebuilt damaged structures, repaired docks, and restored agricultural productivity. Communities incorporated lessons learned from the crisis, such as the importance of early warning systems, the organization of local militias, and the management of resources in times of potential disaster. The knowledge gained extended beyond military concerns, contributing to the resilience of society as a whole. In addition to practical effects, the Mongol invasions left a lasting impression on historical record keeping. Chronicles such as the Azuma Kagami documented the events in detail, recording troop movements, weather conditions, and the outcomes of various skirmishes. These records became important sources for future generations, providing insight into military planning, social organization, and the interaction between human activity and natural forces. Scholars and historians have since examined these texts to understand the methods of medieval Japanese governance and the challenges posed by large-scale invasions. By the later years of the Kamakura shogunate, the Mongol invasions had become central to the collective understanding of national defense. The story of the storm and the scattered fleet was repeated in official accounts, local histories, and oral traditions. It served as both a cautionary tale and an example of effective preparation. The samurai class, whose responsibilities had expanded to include not only personal combat, but also the broader defense of territory, used the experience to refine their skills and strategies. Lessons learned in 1281 influenced training, organization, and planning for decades, shaping the development of Japan's military culture. As the immediate threat of the Mongol fleet faded, life along the western coast of Kyushu returned slowly to a form of normalcy, but the memories of those weeks remained vivid for those who had witnessed them. Villages that had sent their families inland were rebuilt and repaired. Wooden docks that had been damaged by storm, driven debris were reconstructed, and fields that had been temporarily abandoned during the weeks of vigilance were replanted. Fishing fleets returned to the waters, though fishermen remained wary of sudden storms or drifting wreckage from the Mongol ships. Each day brought reminders of what could have happened, and the local population learned to incorporate vigilance into routine life. The samurai, who had defended the walls of Hakata Bay, were recognized for their service, though formal honors were measured and consistent with the era's customs. The shogunate ensured that the loyalty and discipline of these warriors were rewarded in ways that would encourage continued readiness. Some samurai were given additional land or privileges, while others received public recognition for their leadership and coordination during the invasion. The emphasis was always on practical measures, maintaining strength, preserving knowledge, and preparing for future threats. Not all of the samurai experience was ceremonial. The weeks of waiting during the approach of the Mongol fleet had tested endurance, patience, and organization. Daily routines included rotating watch duties, inspecting weapons and armor, maintaining horses, and coordinating with local militias. Communication between units relied on messengers running between posts and signal fires, creating a network that allowed distant groups to respond quickly to threats. This constant movement and observation trained warriors in both patience and precision, qualities that would remain essential for Japanese military culture. Villagers played a critical supporting role. While the samurai defended the walls, ordinary people assisted in fortifying defenses, transporting supplies, and ensuring that livestock and resources were moved to safer locations. Knowledge of local terrain, currents, and tidal patterns proved invaluable. Communities who understood the coastlines and the movement of tides were able to anticipate where enemy ships might attempt to land, and they guided samurai patrols accordingly. The combination of local knowledge and military strategy created a layered defense system, even as the Mongol forces struggled with unfamiliar waters and stormy conditions. The storm itself, which had dispersed the Mongol fleet, continued to be a central topic of reflection and record-keeping. Chroniclers documented not only the timing and intensity of the winds and waves, but also the sequence of events that followed, such as which ships were driven aground, which forces were lost, and which survived. These records included practical details about how the storm interacted with human decisions. For example, commanders who had kept their ships in loose formations found that they were less likely to collide with one another, while groups that remained too close together suffered heavy losses. Such observations would later inform naval practices in Japan, reinforcing the importance of preparation, flexibility, and environmental awareness. Communication between local lords and the central shogunate remained a priority. Reports from the coast reached Kamakura, detailing not only the physical condition of fortifications, but also the morale and readiness of the samurai. These reports allowed central leaders to adjust policies, redistribute resources, and provide guidance to regions that had not yet faced direct threat. The structure of command emphasized efficiency and clarity, ensuring that even distant areas could respond to emergencies. The invasion experience demonstrated that coordination, rather than sheer numbers alone, was a critical factor in national defense. From the perspective of the Mongols, the retreat marked a rare but instructive failure. Soldiers returned to Korea and China with detailed accounts of the difficulties they had faced, including the storm, the challenges of navigating unfamiliar waters, and the effectiveness of Japanese defensive measures. Commanders analyzed the mistakes in planning and logistics, understanding that the timing, organization, and vulnerability of a fleet in open water were critical considerations. Although the empire remained vast and powerful, the failure of the 1281 invasion showed that environmental factors could decisively influence outcomes, even for an army that had conquered much of Asia. The historical memory of the event developed over time in both formal chronicles and oral traditions. Japanese writers recorded the storm as a significant turning point in the defense of the nation. Over generations, the term Kamikaze came to describe the event, emphasizing the role of the wind in dispersing the fleet. Unlike typical battlefield victories, which could be measured in territory gained or lost, the Mongol invasions were defined in part by what did not occur: the absence of successful landing, the failure of occupation, and the preservation of Japanese sovereignty. The experience of the invasion had lasting effects on military strategy and organization. Training routines for samurai were adjusted to include preparation for siege defense, rapid communication, and coordination with local militias. Coastal fortifications were maintained and improved with regular inspections and drills. Knowledge gained from observing the Mongol ships and weaponry was incorporated into Japanese military techniques. For example, long-range bows, polearms, and coordinated infantry tactics were emphasized, reflecting lessons learned from observing the coordinated attacks of the Mongol forces during earlier skirmishes. Societal attitudes toward foreign threats shifted as well. The invasions reinforced the importance of local knowledge, community coordination, and resource management. Villagers and farmers, who might have previously been considered passive contributors, were recognized as essential participants in national defense. This recognition reinforced social cohesion and the integration of civic responsibility into the broader structure of governance. The experience of shared danger strengthened the bonds between local communities and their samurai defenders, creating a sense of interdependence that persisted long after the immediate threat had passed. Economically, the invasions had a measurable impact. Coastal trade was temporarily disrupted during the months of preparation and the weeks of the Mongol approach. Ports were closed or partially abandoned, and fishing activities were limited. Once the fleet had retreated and the storm subsided, communities worked to restore trade routes, repair docks, and resume normal economic activity. The experience highlighted the importance of supply management, stockpiling provisions, and ensuring continuity of resources during crises. These lessons would influence future approaches to logistics, both in times of conflict and in routine governance. The Mongol invasions also influenced the development of Japanese naval knowledge. Although Japan did not possess a large standing navy in the modern sense, the experience demonstrated the strategic importance of coastal surveillance, rapid deployment of small boats, and the effective use of fortifications in combination with environmental conditions. Samurai and local leaders gained an understanding of tides, wind patterns, and coastal currents that would inform future defense planning. Observations about ship construction, armament, and maneuvering were studied carefully, contributing to the evolution of Japanese maritime practices. Culturally, the memory of the invasions became integrated into literature, religious practice, and local identity. Chronicles emphasized both the practical achievements of the samurai and the role of the storm in preserving the islands. Religious interpretations focused on divine protection and the importance of ritual observance, though these were grounded in lived experience rather than purely symbolic belief. Communities constructed or reinforced shrines along the coast to commemorate survival and encourage continued vigilance. The combination of historical record, oral storytelling, and spiritual practice created a layered understanding of the event that endured for centuries. Political implications were also significant. The shogunate leveraged the memory of the Mongol invasions to reinforce its authority, demonstrating its ability to organize defense, coordinate resources, and protect the population. Regional lords who had participated effectively were rewarded or publicly acknowledged, strengthening loyalty and compliance with central directives. The threat of foreign invasion became a reference point for governance, encouraging structured planning, attention to local intelligence, and coordination between civil and military authorities. The psychological impact on the population should not be underestimated. Living through weeks of uncertainty, watching the horizon for signs of the fleet, and enduring the storm itself created a collective memory of caution, preparation, and shared responsibility. Children who experienced the period grew up with stories of vigilance and resilience. Samurai and commoners alike internalized the importance of readiness, resourcefulness, and cooperation. The experience contributed to a national sense of identity that valued both discipline and adaptability. In later decades, historians and scholars examined the 1281 invasion as a case study in the interaction between military planning and environmental forces. The event demonstrated that even the largest, most organized army could be disrupted by weather and unfamiliar terrain. The Japanese defensive strategy, which combined fortifications, observation, and coordinated local response, proved that smaller, well-prepared forces could successfully counter much larger invasions when they leveraged knowledge, planning, and vigilance. The storm itself became a defining symbol, remembered not only as an act of nature, but as a moment that preserved the independence of Japan. It highlighted the unpredictability of historical events, showing that outcomes often depended on the convergence of preparation, circumstance, and natural forces. The combination of human planning and environmental factors shaped the future of the islands, reinforcing lessons about readiness, resilience, and the importance of collective effort. Over the next century, the legacy of the Mongol invasions continued to influence Japanese military and political thought. Coastal fortifications remained maintained, patrols were organized along key points, and the samurai class retained its central role in defense. Stories of the invasion were told to children and apprentices as lessons in vigilance, strategy, and the unpredictable nature of conflict. The historical record preserved both the human effort and the impact of the storm, ensuring that future generations understood the significance of the event. In the aftermath of the failed Mongol invasion, the coastal regions of Kyushu were reshaped in both practical and social ways. Villages that had evacuated their families during the weeks of alert slowly returned to the shoreline, assessing damage caused not only by the storm but also by the scattered remnants of the fleet. Timber from broken ships drifted onto beaches, and mangled barrels, weaponry, and armor were discovered among the debris. Local leaders organized salvage operations to recover materials that could be reused or repurposed, transforming what had been enemy supplies into resources for rebuilding. Metal fittings from armor and weapons were melted down and reforged into tools and implements, while wood from broken ships was often used for repairing docks and homes. This process of recovery was methodical and careful, reflecting the Japanese attention to resource management and the practical demands of survival. Meanwhile, the samurai stationed at fortifications remained on alert for months, understanding that the threat of further attacks had not entirely disappeared. Even as the immediate danger receded, rotations of watchkeepers and patrols along the coastline continued. Leaders emphasized the importance of routine inspection of defensive walls, reinforcing areas that had been damaged by the storm or tested by small-scale skirmishes. Patrols coordinated with local villagers who provided intelligence on tides, currents, and suspicious sightings. The experience of vigilance during the invasion had left a lasting impression, and these routines became institutionalized, forming part of the standard responsibilities of samurai households and regional lords. The social impact of the Mongol invasions extended beyond the immediate military and logistical concerns. Ordinary villagers who had assisted in preparing defenses were recognized for their contributions. While the samurai were the primary armed defenders, their effectiveness depended on the support and knowledge of local populations. Villagers had guided patrols along difficult coastal terrain, assisted in transporting supplies, and reinforced temporary barriers along the shoreline. In some cases, small groups of peasants joined samurai in defensive skirmishes, demonstrating both courage and the critical role of collective effort. The shogunate acknowledged this support by formalizing local responsibilities for defense, creating a system in which civilians and warriors shared the duty of maintaining vigilance against foreign threats. The experience of the invasion also affected the internal politics of the Kamakura shogunate. Leaders in Kamakura recognized that central authority depended on coordination with regional lords, whose loyalty and competence were critical in times of crisis. After the invasion, officials conducted extensive assessments of regional governance, evaluating the effectiveness of local defenses, the responsiveness of samurai units, and the management of supplies. Lords who had demonstrated exceptional leadership were rewarded with recognition, land grants, or other privileges. Conversely, those who had failed to maintain readiness faced scrutiny or reduced influence. These measures reinforced the importance of accountability and encouraged disciplined organization across the shogunate's territories. Economic consequences were intertwined with the social and military outcomes. Coastal trade had been disrupted during the invasion, with fishing and merchant activity curtailed due to the presence of the fleet and the subsequent storm. Once the immediate crisis passed, communities prioritized the restoration of trade routes, repair of harbor infrastructure, and resumption of commercial activity. Lessons learned from the invasion emphasized the need for redundancy in supply systems, the stockpiling of essential goods, and the capacity to maintain continuity in commerce under emergency conditions. This awareness of logistics extended beyond military concerns, influencing local economic management and the integration of regional resources into broader governance. Culturally, the memory of the invasion shaped Japanese identity and historical consciousness. Chroniclers documented the events with meticulous attention to detail, noting not only the number of ships and soldiers involved, but also the sequence of actions taken by defenders and the timing and effects of the storm. These accounts emphasized the interplay between human planning and natural forces, portraying the outcome as the result of both preparation and circumstance. The term Kamikaze, later associated with the event, reflected this combination. It described the wind that dispersed the fleet, while also symbolizing the preservation of the islands. Religious and ceremonial interpretations emerged alongside practical accounts, reinforcing a sense of moral and spiritual significance attached to the successful defense. Religious institutions played an active role in commemorating the event. Shinto shrines along the western coast of Kyushu, some of which had been focal points for prayer during the invasion, became sites of remembrance. Rituals were conducted to honor those who had defended the land, and ceremonies emphasized gratitude for protection from harm. Buddhist monks contributed by maintaining records and offering prayers for continued peace and vigilance. The integration of historical record, ritual observance, and local memory created a layered understanding of the event, blending practical, spiritual, and social dimensions into a coherent narrative of national resilience. The broader strategic lessons of the Mongol invasions were integrated into Japanese military thought. The experience highlighted the importance of combining static fortifications with mobile patrols, the need for rapid communication across dispersed territories, and the value of leveraging local environmental knowledge. Samurai households incorporated these lessons into their training routines, emphasizing not only individual skill, but also coordination and adaptability. Small-scale skirmishes and reconnaissance missions were practiced regularly, ensuring that warriors could respond effectively to unpredictable threats. Knowledge gained from the invasions influenced the design and construction of defensive walls, the deployment of troops, and the management of supplies, shaping the tactical approach of the samurai for generations. The Mongol invasions also had a lasting effect on Japanese perceptions of foreign powers. The scale and organization of the fleet impressed Japanese observers, demonstrating both the logistical capabilities and the military discipline of a vast empire. At the same time, the failure of the invasion reinforced confidence in local preparedness and resilience. Leaders and commoners alike understood that national survival depended on a combination of disciplined defense, community coordination, and strategic use of environmental conditions. This understanding shaped subsequent policies regarding foreign relations, coastal defense, and national security, influencing Japan's approach to interactions with neighboring states and distant powers. Individual experiences during the invasion were recorded with increasing attention to detail in local chronicles and family histories. Samurai who had commanded units along the defensive walls documented the timing of patrols, the deployment of troops, and the specific encounters with enemy forces. Villagers recorded their observations of the storm, including the patterns of wind and waves and the location of wreckage. Over time, these accounts were compiled into broader historical narratives that preserve both the human and environmental dimensions of the events. These records served as reference points for military planning, cultural memory, and civic education, providing future generations with detailed insights into the practical realities of defending the islands. In addition to military and social effects, the invasion influenced technological awareness. Samurai and craftsmen studied the construction of Mongol ships, observing the design of hulls, rigging, and weapon placements. This knowledge informed improvements in Japanese shipbuilding techniques, even though Japan did not develop a large standing navy comparable to the Mongol fleet. Similarly, observations of armor, weapons, and tactical formations were analyzed, leading to refinements in local military equipment and training methods. The process of examining enemy technology and adapting lessons to local conditions became a standard practice, demonstrating the value of careful observation and analysis in national defense. Education and training for samurai were directly shaped by the experience of the invasions. Beyond individual combat skills, emphasis was placed on the ability to organize, communicate, and coordinate with other units under pressure. Drills incorporated simulated scenarios of enemy landings, supply shortages, and sudden environmental changes. Younger warriors were taught to observe, adapt, and anticipate challenges, reflecting the lessons of the storm that had dispersed the Mongol fleet. Knowledge of terrain, tides, and weather patterns was integrated into instruction, ensuring that future generations of samurai were prepared not only for combat, but also for the practical demands of defending coastal regions. The psychological impact of the invasion extended to the broader population as well. Living through the weeks of tension, watching for distant sails, and responding to warnings of approaching forces instilled a heightened awareness of risk and responsibility. Communities learned to act collectively, coordinating responses, managing resources, and maintaining vigilance. The memory of the storm and the preservation of the islands reinforced the value of preparedness and the importance of shared effort. Stories of survival, resilience, and disciplined defense were transmitted across generations, shaping cultural attitudes towards security, risk, and communal responsibility. The political landscape was influenced by the experience of the Mongol invasions. The shogunate's successful coordination of defenses reinforced its authority and demonstrated the practical value of central oversight. Regional lords who had participated effectively in the defense gained influence and recognition, while those who had failed to maintain readiness were subject to scrutiny. The experience created a framework in which accountability, loyalty, and competence were emphasized, ensuring that the governance structures established during the Kamakura period remained stable and functional. The invasions became a reference point for leadership, reinforcing the importance of preparation, planning, and decisive action in maintaining order and protecting the realm. Religious and ceremonial practices evolved in response to the invasion. Shrines and temples along the coast became focal points for memorialization and ritual observance. Annual ceremonies commemorated the defense, while prayers for protection and guidance became integrated into local practice. The blending of historical awareness, spiritual reflection, and community participation reinforced social cohesion, creating a shared understanding of the significance of the events. The combination of practical experience and spiritual interpretation provided a multidimensional perspective that informed both daily life and governance. After the immediate crisis of the Mongol invasion and the dispersing storm, the Kamakura shogunate undertook a systematic effort to strengthen the governance and defensive structures of Japan. While the storm had prevented the Mongols from landing successfully, the leadership understood that relying solely on natural events was neither sustainable nor reliable. The months and years following the failed invasion were marked by careful attention to organization, resource management, and the standardization of defensive procedures along the western coast. Coastal fortifications were expanded and reinforced. Existing walls along Hakata Bay were repaired where they had been damaged by the storm or weakened by small-scale engagements. Gaps between fortifications were closed, and watchtowers were erected at key points along the shore to provide early warning of approaching vessels. These towers were manned in rotation, ensuring that alertness was maintained around the clock. The shogunate also encouraged the construction of temporary barriers and ditches that could slow or divert enemy forces in the event of future attacks. Although no further Mongol invasions occurred at the same scale, the lessons of 1274 and 1281 guided defensive planning for decades. The organization of samurai units was refined during this period. Local lords were instructed to maintain standing contingents of warriors prepared for rapid deployment along the coast. Training routines included both individual martial skills and coordinated group maneuvers, ensuring that smaller units could operate independently if necessary, while still contributing to the broader defense network. Samurai were also trained to work closely with local militias composed of villagers and farmers, integrating civilian knowledge of the terrain, tides, and local resources into defensive operations. This collaboration strengthened social cohesion and ensured that both professional warriors and ordinary people shared responsibility for national security. Communities that had experienced the invasion firsthand adapted their daily practices to incorporate lessons in readiness and vigilance. Villagers participated in drills, learned to manage emergency supplies, and maintained basic communication systems for relaying information about approaching vessels or unusual activity along the shore. Agricultural practices were adjusted to ensure that critical food supplies could be protected in case of future threats. Families stored rice, salted fish, and other essentials, recognizing that survival in times of crisis depended on preparation as much as on skill or strength. The experience of managing resources and coordinating defensive measures led to a greater emphasis on administrative efficiency within the shogunate. Records were meticulously maintained to track the condition of fortifications, the readiness of samurai units, and the availability of supplies. These records were updated regularly and communicated to central authorities in Kamakura. The process strengthened the bureaucratic framework of the shogunate and demonstrated the importance of systematic planning in maintaining both security and governance. The psychological impact of the invasions persisted for decades. Communities along the coast retained a heightened awareness of the vulnerability of Japan to foreign threats. Stories of the storm and the scattered Mongol fleet were shared across generations, emphasizing both the role of preparation and the power of natural forces. Children grew up hearing accounts of vigilant samurai, cooperative villagers, and the enormous fleet that had been halted by a sudden storm. The memory of these events reinforced cultural values of discipline, responsibility, and community cooperation, contributing to a national identity that prized readiness and resilience. Religious interpretations of the events gained prominence alongside practical measures. Shrines along the western coast became associated with divine protection, and rituals commemorating the defense of the islands were integrated into local practice. Buddhist monks documented the events and offered prayers for continued safety, while Shinto priests emphasized the importance of gratitude and moral conduct in maintaining harmony and protection. These spiritual frameworks reinforced social cohesion, providing both practical guidance and moral support to communities recovering from the shock of invasion and the threat of foreign conquest. The shogunate also used the memory of the Mongol invasions to reinforce central authority. Regional lords who had effectively mobilized their forces and contributed to the defense were publicly acknowledged, while those who had failed to maintain readiness were reprimanded or had their influence curtailed. This system of accountability ensured that preparedness became a standard expectation across the archipelago, reinforcing the hierarchical structure of governance and maintaining the loyalty and competence of local leadership. Economically, the period following the invasions saw gradual restoration and improvement. Ports and coastal infrastructure damaged by the storm were repaired, fishing fleets returned to the waters, and trade routes resumed normal operation. The experience of disruption highlighted the importance of maintaining redundancy in supply chains and storing essential resources for emergencies. Local economies incorporated the lessons of the invasions into long-term planning, ensuring that food, water, and materials could be accessed even in times of crisis. This emphasis on practical preparedness extended beyond military considerations, contributing to the resilience and sustainability of communities throughout Japan. Education and training for samurai and civilians alike incorporated lessons from the invasions. Young warriors were taught to observe and anticipate both human and environmental challenges. Drills simulated scenarios of enemy landings, sudden storms, and disrupted supply lines. Knowledge of tides, coastal terrain, and weather patterns was integrated into instruction, ensuring that future generations of samurai were prepared not only for direct combat, but also for the logistical and strategic demands of defending the islands. Civilians were educated in basic defensive practices, emphasizing cooperation and the importance of local knowledge in supporting national security. The Mongol invasions also influenced Japanese naval awareness and technology. Although Japan did not develop a large centralized navy, the experience highlighted the strategic importance of small, maneuverable vessels, coastal surveillance, and the ability to respond rapidly to threats from the sea. Observations of Mongol ship construction, armor deployment, and tactical formations informed Japanese maritime practices, shaping the design of boats and the coordination of coastal defenses for centuries. Samurai learned to use small craft effectively, integrating mobility and local knowledge into broader strategic planning. Social structures were reinforced by the shared experience of invasion and recovery. Villagers and farmers who had assisted in defense were acknowledged for their contributions, reinforcing the interdependence of civilian and military roles. The experience strengthened social bonds and collective responsibility, creating a culture in which community preparedness and cooperation were recognized as essential to survival. Leadership within villages and towns was reinforced by the recognition that local knowledge and initiative could directly influence the outcome of a crisis. Cultural memory of the Mongol invasions was preserved in chronicles, oral histories, and ceremonial practices. Written accounts recorded the sequence of events in meticulous detail, including the timing of patrols, the deployment of samurai units, the progression of the storm, and the impact on the Mongol fleet. Oral traditions emphasized the courage, discipline, and vigilance of the defenders, creating narratives that blended practical lessons with moral and social instruction. Ceremonial practices commemorated the defense, integrating historical memory into religious and civic life. The combination of written record, oral storytelling, and ritual observance ensured that the experience of the invasions remained central to Japanese historical consciousness for generations. The political and military lessons of the Mongol invasions influenced governance and strategy long after 1281. The shogunate maintained strict oversight of regional lords, requiring regular reporting on military readiness and resource management. Coastal fortifications were maintained and improved, and the coordination between samurai, villagers, and central authorities became institutionalized. The experience demonstrated that preparedness, communication, and organization could compensate for numerical inferiority, highlighting the importance of systematic planning and disciplined execution in national defense. Historians and scholars in subsequent centuries examined the Mongol invasions as case studies in military logistics, coastal defense, and the interaction between human planning and environmental factors. The events demonstrated that even large, disciplined forces could be disrupted by natural phenomena, emphasizing the importance of adaptation, observation, and strategic flexibility. Japanese chroniclers documented the invasions in detail, providing valuable insights into medieval governance, military organization, and social structures. The combination of careful record keeping, practical experience, and collective memory created a historical framework that informed both contemporary and later understanding of national defense. Individual experiences during the invasion were also preserved. Samurai who had commanded units recorded tactical decisions, troop movements, and observations of enemy behavior. Villagers documented the patterns of the storm, the location of wreckage, and their own actions in assisting the defense. These accounts provided practical knowledge for future generations, emphasizing the integration of human effort with environmental observation. Families preserved stories of ancestors who had participated in the defense, creating a sense of lineage and continuity that reinforced cultural identity and social cohesion. The Mongol invasions of 1274 and 1281 ultimately shaped Japan's approach to national security, military training, and civic responsibility. The storm of 1281, while decisive in preventing a successful landing, was only part of the story. Japanese preparation, organization, and vigilance ensured that the islands could withstand the threat. Lessons learned from these invasions informed the development of defensive strategies, the organization of samurai units, and the role of civilian participation in maintaining security. These lessons extended beyond immediate military concerns, influencing governance, economic planning, and cultural memory for generations. The long-term significance of the invasions included the reinforcement of social cohesion, the development of strategic thought, and the preservation of sovereignty. Coastal fortifications remained maintained, samurai training incorporated lessons from the encounters, and communities integrated preparedness into everyday life. Religious and ceremonial practices reflected the collective memory of survival, creating moral and spiritual frameworks that supported civic stability. The combination of human effort and environmental circumstance that defined the 1281 invasion became a central element of Japanese historical consciousness, illustrating the complex interplay of preparation, adaptation, and external forces in shaping the fate of a nation. As the years passed after the failed Mongol invasions, the memory of 1281 remained vivid among both the samurai class and the ordinary people who had lived through the crisis. In coastal villages along Kyushu, families recalled the weeks of heightened vigilance, the constant watch over the horizon, and the nights spent listening to the wind and the crashing of waves. Parents told children how the samurai had manned the walls, how small boats patrolled the bay at night, and how the fleet had been scattered by the sudden storm. These stories, repeated over time, became a part of the cultural fabric, not only preserving historical facts, but also emphasizing lessons in preparedness, discipline, and communal responsibility. The samurai who had commanded defenses along Hakata Bay carried the memory of the invasion into their daily routines and into their leadership of households and local garrisons. Veteran warriors trained younger recruits using the lessons learned from observing Mongol tactics, the challenges of coordinating large numbers of troops, and the unpredictable role of natural forces. Training emphasized not only individual combat skill, but also organization, communication, and strategic thinking. Units were drilled to respond quickly to potential landings, to coordinate with local militias, and to use knowledge of the terrain, tides, and weather to their advantage. This approach shaped the development of the samurai as both fighters and planners, capable of integrating practical observation with disciplined execution. Villagers also absorbed lessons from the invasion. Coastal populations learned to maintain vigilance, prepare supplies, and respond quickly to warnings. Fishermen, for example, developed systems for tracking changes in the wind and tides, understanding that these natural indicators could provide early warning of approaching fleets or storms. Farmers developed strategies for protecting crops and livestock, ensuring that essential resources were available in times of crisis. Communities established networks of communication with messengers and signal posts that allowed information to travel rapidly between villages and fortifications. These practical adaptations reinforced social cohesion, emphasizing the interdependence of civilians and warriors in ensuring the safety of the islands. Political consequences of the invasions continued to unfold over the decades. The Kamikaze shogunate, having demonstrated the ability to organize a coordinated defense, strengthened its authority and influence across the archipelago. Regional lords who had proven capable in mobilizing forces were rewarded with land, recognition, or enhanced status within the shogunate hierarchy. Those who had shown weakness or negligence were scrutinized and sometimes replaced, creating a culture of accountability that reinforced centralized control. The experience of the Mongol invasions served as a reference point for governance, illustrating the necessity of disciplined leadership, structured communication, and rapid decision-making in maintaining both security and political stability. The Mongol invasions also left a lasting impact on the economy. Coastal trade, which had been temporarily disrupted during the weeks of alarm and the storm itself, recovered gradually but with changes informed by experience. Villages improved storage facilities, ensuring that essential food supplies, weapons, and other materials could withstand periods of disruption. Merchants and local officials developed plans for redirecting trade or supplies in times of crisis. The emphasis on logistical preparation reflected the lessons of the invasions, demonstrating that survival depended not only on martial skill, but also on effective resource management and foresight. Cultural memory of the invasions was reinforced through literature, chronicles, and oral storytelling. Works such as the Azuma Kagami recorded not only military movements and outcomes, but also the timing of patrols, the observations of coastal conditions, and the accounts of individual samurai and villagers. Oral histories emphasized courage, coordination, and resilience, highlighting the roles of both professional warriors and ordinary citizens. Over time, these stories were woven into broader cultural narratives, shaping the collective identity of Japan and reinforcing values of discipline, preparation, and communal responsibility. Religious practices reflected both the memory of the storm and the practical measures taken to ensure survival. Shinto shrines along the western coast of Kyushu became sites of commemoration and ritual, with ceremonies honoring those who had defended the land and prayers for continued protection. Buddhist temples also contributed to the preservation of memory, recording events, offering prayers, and interpreting the invasion as an occasion for reflection on human effort and the forces of nature. These spiritual frameworks supported social cohesion, creating a shared understanding of historical significance and reinforcing the integration of moral and practical guidance. The experience of the invasions influenced military organization in profound ways. Coastal fortifications were maintained and expanded, with new ditches, walls, and watchtowers constructed to anticipate future threats. Samurai units were trained to respond not only to direct attack, but also to the challenges of coordination under adverse conditions. Small patrol units were integrated with local militias, allowing rapid response and flexible deployment. Observations of Mongol ships and tactics informed improvements in Japanese weaponry and equipment, including the use of long-range bows, polearms, and coordinated infantry maneuvers. Knowledge of tides, currents, and coastal terrain was incorporated into training, ensuring that strategic planning was informed by the environment. Individual samurai and local leaders recorded their experiences in detailed accounts that would become part of the historical record. Commanders noted the effectiveness of particular defensive strategies, the impact of weather on troop movements, and the interactions between samurai units and civilian populations. Villagers documented observations of the storm, the location of wreckage, and their own contributions to defense efforts. These records created a detailed understanding of the events and provided practical lessons for future generations. The preservation of such knowledge emphasized the importance of learning from experience and maintaining institutional memory. The Mongol invasions also influenced Japan's broader understanding of foreign powers. Observers recognized the scale, organization, and logistical capabilities of the Mongol Empire, gaining insight into the strengths and limitations of distant powers. At the same time, The failure of the invasions reinforced confidence in Japan's defensive strategies, highlighting the effectiveness of preparation, coordination, and knowledge of local conditions. This awareness informed future policies regarding external threats, coastal defense, and diplomacy, shaping Japan's approach to interactions with neighboring states and foreign powers. Economically, the lessons of the invasions reinforced the importance of preparedness and resource management. Villages developed systems for storing essential food supplies, maintaining tools and weapons, and ensuring access to water and other critical resources. Fishermen and farmers adapted practices to anticipate potential disruptions, including the ability to relocate livestock or protect crops from environmental hazards. These practical adaptations strengthened the resilience of local economies and provided a foundation for sustainable resource management in the centuries following the invasions. Education and training for samurai incorporated both practical and strategic lessons. Young warriors were taught to anticipate the movement of forces, understand environmental conditions, and coordinate effectively with other units and local militias. Drills simulated landings, sudden storms, and supply disruptions, emphasizing adaptability, observation, and disciplined response. Knowledge of tides, coastal terrain, and weather patterns was integrated into instruction, ensuring that samurai were prepared for the complex realities of defending the islands. Civilians were also educated in basic defensive practices, highlighting the shared responsibility for communal security. The storm that dispersed the Mongol fleet, often referred to as the Kamikaze, became a central symbol in Japanese historical consciousness. While the event was interpreted in spiritual terms, it was equally understood as a demonstration of the interaction between human preparation and environmental forces. Chroniclers emphasized both the storm's role and the careful organization of Japanese defenses, presenting the outcome as a combination of natural occurrence and deliberate action. This understanding reinforced the importance of vigilance, coordination, and adaptability in shaping historical outcomes. Political structures were strengthened by the experience of invasion and recovery. The shogunate used the memory of the Mongol attempts to enforce standards of accountability, ensuring that regional lords maintained readiness and competence. Coastal fortifications were inspected regularly, and reports of military preparedness were required to reach central authorities. These practices reinforced centralized governance while maintaining the autonomy of local leaders within a disciplined and coordinated framework. The experience demonstrated the value of structured oversight and accountability in maintaining both security and political stability. The psychological impact of the invasions persisted for generations. Communities along the coast retained a heightened awareness of potential threats, and stories of vigilance, preparation, and survival were passed down through families. Samurai maintained routines of training and observation, while villagers participated in drills and monitoring of coastal conditions. The experience fostered a culture in which readiness, discipline, and communal responsibility were integral to daily life. The collective memory of the Mongol invasions reinforced social cohesion, ensuring that future generations understood the importance of cooperation and preparedness in times of crisis. Religious and ceremonial practices continued to reinforce the memory of the invasions. Shrines and temples became focal points for annual observances, emphasizing both gratitude for survival and reflection on the responsibilities of defense. These practices blended historical memory, spiritual reflection, and social cohesion, creating a layered understanding of the significance of the events. The integration of ritual and record keeping provided a framework in which communities could preserve knowledge, honor those who had served, and maintain social stability. The years following the Mongol invasions were marked by a careful examination of both the immediate events and the larger implications for Japan. Scholars, officials, and military leaders considered the lessons learned from 1281 when the massive Mongol fleet had approached the western coast of Kyushu, only to be scattered by a sudden and violent storm. In retrospect, the storm appeared almost miraculous, for it destroyed the greater portion of the invading force without a single decisive battle being fought on land. Yet, the leaders of the Kamakura shogunate understood that the storm alone had not been sufficient to protect Japan. It had been the preparation, coordination, and vigilance of samurai and local communities that had created conditions in which a natural event could decisively favor the defenders. Along the shores of Hakata Bay, samurai veterans of the invasion continued to train new generations of warriors, emphasizing the importance of readiness and observation. The defensive walls and ditches that had been constructed in anticipation of the Mongol landing were maintained rigorously. Watchtowers remained manned, and regular patrols monitored the coastline, even during periods of apparent calm. Young samurai were instructed not only in martial arts but also in the organization of troops, the signaling between posts, and the coordination of local militias. They were taught to understand tides, wind direction, and currents, recognizing that such knowledge could prove as decisive as skill in combat. The villagers who had assisted during the invasion also retained heightened awareness. Families who had fled inland during the approach of the fleet returned to rebuild, but they implemented new routines of readiness. Crops and livestock were stored in secure locations, signaling methods were rehearsed, and groups of able-bodied men were trained to support the defense in case of future threats. Even those who did not participate directly in combat understood that survival depended on collective effort, coordination, and vigilance. The social fabric of these communities was strengthened by the shared memory of the invasion, and cooperation became an integral part of daily life. The role of the storm itself, often called the Kamikaze, was carefully recorded in official chronicles and oral histories. Observers documented the timing and intensity of the winds, noting the patterns by which ships were driven ashore, capsized, or wrecked upon rocks. Commanders reported which segments of the Mongol fleet were lost first, and how the remaining forces struggled against both the storm and the defensive positions along the coast. While the event was imbued with spiritual significance over time, early records emphasized practical observations, the destructive power of natural forces, the vulnerability of tightly grouped ships, and the advantages gained by defenders who had anticipated potential environmental hazards. Political authorities in Kamakura used the memory of the invasions to reinforce governance structures. Regional lords were reminded that preparedness and competence could determine the fate of entire regions. Those who had successfully mobilized troops and organized defenses were publicly acknowledged and often granted additional responsibilities, while those who had failed to respond were censured or replaced. This system of accountability ensured that the lessons of the Mongol invasions would influence future governance, reinforcing centralized authority and the importance of disciplined leadership at all levels. Economically, the experience of 1281 influenced local and regional planning. Ports and trade networks that had been disrupted by the invasion and the storm were repaired, but planners also incorporated contingency measures. Storage facilities for food, weapons, and other essential goods were strengthened, and supply routes were evaluated for potential vulnerabilities. Communities learned that economic resilience required planning for both military and environmental challenges. This integration of resource management into defense strategy would influence Japanese governance and civil planning for generations, emphasizing that survival depended on preparation as much as on combat skill. Cultural memory of the storm and the failed invasion became an essential part of Japanese identity. Chronicles such as the Azuma Kagami recorded the events in meticulous detail, noting both the efforts of human defenders and the impact of the storm. Oral histories emphasized the courage and discipline of the samurai, the cooperation of villagers, and the role of environmental factors in determining the outcome. Over time, these stories contributed to a national narrative in which the survival of Japan was understood to be the result of both human planning and natural intervention. The term kamikaze would endure, reflecting the dual significance of the storms, a natural event that preserved the islands and a symbol of the effectiveness of preparation and collective effort. The Mongols, having lost much of their fleet, retreated to Korea and China with detailed accounts of the difficulties they had faced. Soldiers and commanders reported not only the destructive storm, but also the challenges posed by Japanese fortifications, the coordination of samurai units, and the vigilance of local populations. While the empire remained vast, the failure of the invasion illustrated the limitations of military power when confronted with environmental forces and a well-prepared, disciplined opponent. Strategists in Kublai Khan's court debated whether further attempts to invade Japan were feasible, ultimately concluding that the combination of Japanese preparedness and natural hazards made another large-scale invasion extremely risky. The lessons learned from the failed invasion influenced Japanese military organization in subsequent decades. Fortifications along the western coast remained in place and were improved over time, incorporating both practical engineering and observational knowledge of coastal conditions. Samurai training emphasized flexibility, observation, and coordination, preparing units to respond to both enemy action and environmental factors. Local militias were integrated into defense planning, ensuring that civilian knowledge of terrain, tides, and currents complemented professional military skill. These measures reflected a deep understanding that human effort and natural forces could act together to protect the islands, with neither alone being sufficient. Education for samurai during this period emphasized the practical, strategic, and observational skills necessary for coastal defense. Young warriors were taught to anticipate enemy behavior, understand weather patterns, and respond effectively to sudden changes in circumstances. Drills simulated landings, storms, and supply disruptions, reinforcing the importance of adaptability and disciplined response. Knowledge of local geography, wind patterns, and tidal behavior was incorporated into instruction, ensuring that samurai could leverage environmental conditions as part of their strategy. This focus on observation and preparedness became a hallmark of Japanese military culture, influencing the development of strategy for centuries. Social structures were reinforced by the shared experience of the Mongol invasions. Villagers who had assisted in defenses were acknowledged and rewarded, creating stronger bonds between civilian populations and the samurai. Families maintained stories of their participation, passing lessons and traditions down to subsequent generations. Communities developed a heightened sense of responsibility, recognizing that survival depended on coordinated effort and the proper use of local knowledge. This integration of social cohesion into defense planning ensured that preparedness became a routine part of life, rather than a temporary response to an extraordinary threat. Religious practices developed in response to the invasion reinforced these lessons. Shrines and temples along the coast were associated with protection and gratitude, hosting rituals that commemorated the defense of the islands. These practices combined historical memory, moral instruction, and social cohesion, creating a framework in which communities could reflect on their experience, honor the efforts of defenders, and reinforce the values of vigilance and cooperation. The integration of ritual observance with practical preparedness created a layered understanding of the invasion that influenced both spiritual and civic life. Politically, the shogunate used the experience to strengthen the framework of centralized authority. Regional lords were required to report on readiness, maintain fortifications, and coordinate with neighboring regions. Inspections and audits of defensive preparations became routine, ensuring that knowledge gained from the Mongol invasions was institutionalized. The successful coordination of defenses during the crisis served as a reference point for governance, demonstrating the value of disciplined leadership, clear communication, and proactive planning. The psychological impact of the invasions persisted for decades. Communities along the western coast retained a heightened sense of vigilance, and stories of the storm and the defense were passed down through generations. Samurai and villagers alike internalized lessons in observation, coordination, and preparedness. The collective memory of the invasion reinforced social norms regarding discipline, responsibility, and communal effort. Young people learned that survival depended on both individual skill and the effective collaboration of the community, embedding practical lessons into cultural consciousness. Technologically, the invasions prompted careful observation and adaptation. Samurai and craftsmen studied Mongol ships and weapons, noting their construction, armor, and tactical deployment. While Japan did not develop a large centralized navy, knowledge gained from the invasions informed shipbuilding techniques, defensive planning, and coastal operations. Observations of enemy formations and equipment were integrated into training and strategy, enhancing the effectiveness of local forces and improving the defensive capacity of the islands. Economically, the invasions reinforced the importance of resilience and preparation. Coastal towns developed systems for storing essential supplies, managing trade, and protecting critical infrastructure. The lessons of 1281 highlighted the need for redundancy, ensuring that communities could withstand disruptions caused by both natural forces and military threats. These practices contributed to the long-term sustainability of local economies and the ability of the islands to maintain stability even under pressure. As the years passed, the survivors of the Mongol invasions carried with them vivid memories of the threat that had approached their shores and the storm that had dispersed it. Coastal villages, in particular, were transformed by the experience. Families who had fled inland during the weeks of tension returned to rebuilt homes, repaired docks, and reclaimed fields that had been abandoned during the emergency. Yet even in the process of restoration, there was a cautious awareness that the future could bring similar dangers. Villagers maintained systems of vigilance, assigning watch duties and communicating regularly with neighboring settlements to ensure that any approaching fleets or unusual activity could be observed and reported. Samurai veterans of the defense took on crucial roles as teachers and leaders. They organized training for younger warriors, focusing not only on martial skill, but also on observation, coordination, and strategic decision-making. Patrols were simulated under controlled conditions, with exercises designed to replicate enemy landings and the logistical challenges posed by adverse weather. Knowledge of tides, wind, and coastal currents was passed down carefully, ensuring that the next generation could respond effectively to threats. The storm of 1281 became an enduring example in these lessons. It demonstrated how environmental factors could drastically influence outcomes, emphasizing that preparation and strategic insight were essential complements to physical strength. The role of the storm itself became increasingly recognized as a decisive factor in Japan's survival. Chroniclers documented the sequence of events in precise detail, noting which segments of the Mongol fleet were destroyed first and how wind and wave patterns contributed to their dispersal. Observers reported the capsizing of vessels, the grounding of ships on reefs, and the chaos that ensued as the fleet attempted to regroup. While the storm could be interpreted in spiritual terms, early records emphasized practical lessons. Enemy ships tightly clustered together were especially vulnerable, and even disciplined forces could be overwhelmed by environmental forces. Japanese commanders understood that their preparations had maximized the strategic advantage provided by the storm, enabling the islands to remain unconquered. Political structures were reshaped in response to the invasion experience. The Kamakura shogunate reinforced the requirement that regional lords maintain readiness at all times. Reports on troop readiness Fortification conditions and supply management were required to reach central authorities in Kamakura regularly. Lords who had demonstrated skillful coordination during the invasions were recognized, while those who had neglected responsibilities were subject to scrutiny or reassignment. The Mongol invasions created a system in which accountability, preparedness, and disciplined leadership became central principles of governance. The storm's intervention highlighted the fragility of success. Without human organization, natural forces alone could not protect the islands without competent leadership and coordination. Economically, the invasions demonstrated the importance of resilience and redundancy. Coastal trade had been disrupted during the crisis, and ports had suffered damage from both human activity and the storm. Communities responded by creating storage facilities for food, tools, and materials essential for both survival and rebuilding. Merchants adapted trade routes to ensure continuity even in times of emergency, and local authorities implemented systems for rapid distribution of supplies. These measures ensured that communities could recover quickly from disruptions, integrating lessons from both the Mongol fleet's approach and the storm's impact into long-term economic planning. Cultural memory of the invasions was carefully preserved. Chronicles such as the Azuma Kagami recorded precise details of troop deployments, ship movements, and environmental conditions. Oral traditions emphasized the courage of samurai, the cooperation of villagers, and the storm's decisive influence. Over time, these accounts became part of Japan's broader understanding of its history, reinforcing values of preparation, discipline, and communal effort. The term kamikaze, applied to the storm, came to symbolize both the destructive power of nature and the successful defense achieved through human readiness and coordination. Military organization was transformed by the lessons of 1281. Coastal fortifications were maintained and improved, incorporating both engineering and environmental observation. Watchtowers were constructed at strategic points, and patrols monitored the coastline for signs of approaching fleets or changes in wind and tide patterns. Samurai training emphasized not only individual combat skill, but also coordinated maneuvers, communication between units, and integration with local militias. This holistic approach to defense recognized that human effort and environmental factors work together to create strategic advantage, with neither alone being sufficient. Education for samurai and villagers incorporated detailed knowledge of the events of 1281. Young warriors were taught to anticipate the movement of enemy forces, understand wind and tidal patterns, and coordinate effectively with other units. Drills simulated emergency situations, including landings, supply disruptions, and sudden storms. Villagers were educated in basic defensive practices and the importance of reporting observations, ensuring that local knowledge contributed to the broader defensive strategy. This focus on preparedness and observation created a culture in which both professional and civilian populations were integrated into national defense. Religious and ceremonial practices reflected both the memory of survival and the lessons learned. Shrines along the western coast commemorated the defense and encouraged gratitude and reflection. Buddhist temples maintained records, offered prayers, and emphasized moral conduct as part of communal protection. These practices reinforced social cohesion, blending historical memory with spiritual guidance. By embedding the experience of 1281 into ritual life, communities ensured that the lessons of vigilance, cooperation, and respect for natural forces would be remembered and transmitted through generations. The Mongol invasions also influenced Japan's understanding of foreign powers. Observers recognized the organization, discipline, and logistical capacity of the Mongol Empire. Yet the failure of the invasions, compounded by the storm, demonstrated the limits of external power when confronted with preparation, vigilance, and environmental hazards. This awareness shaped Japan's approach to foreign relations, coastal defense, and strategic planning for centuries. The storm's role became a reference point in understanding how external threats could be mitigated through readiness and the strategic use of local conditions. Psychologically, the invasions left a lasting imprint on coastal communities. Families remembered the tension of the weeks preceding the storm, the vigilance required to monitor distant sails, and the relief when the fleet was destroyed. Stories of the samurai's discipline, villagers' cooperation, and the storm's intervention were repeated in households, ensuring that future generations internalized lessons of preparedness, responsibility, and communal effort. These narratives reinforced cultural values, emphasizing observation, coordination, and strategic thinking, linking lived experience to broader historical consciousness. Technological awareness also expanded as a result of the invasions. Samurai and craftsmen carefully studied Mongol ships and weaponry, noting hull design, rigging, armor, and tactical deployment. Observations informed improvements in Japanese shipbuilding, weaponry, and fortification practices, even though Japan did not maintain a large centralized navy. Knowledge gained from the invasions was integrated into both training and planning, ensuring that lessons were preserved and applied to future defensive measures. The storm's destruction of the fleet highlighted the vulnerability of even technologically advanced forces to environmental forces, emphasizing the need for adaptive planning. Economically, the long-term response to the invasions reinforced the importance of preparation and continuity. Villages developed systems for storing essential supplies, maintaining infrastructure, and ensuring the rapid distribution of resources during crises. The invasions demonstrated that resilience depended on both planning and disciplined execution. Coastal economies incorporated lessons learned from disrupted trade, damaged ports, and the movement of fleets, ensuring that future disruptions could be managed effectively. The storm itself, gradually revealed as the central factor in saving Japan, became a symbol in both historical record and cultural consciousness. While the samurai's preparation, the villagers' vigilance, and the shogunate's coordination had all been essential, it was the timing and intensity of the storm that prevented the Mongols from landing successfully. Chroniclers emphasized that the outcome was the product of both human and environmental factors. The storm acted as a force multiplier for careful planning, allowing the defenders' efforts to have maximum effect. Over time, the storm's decisive role was reinforced in literature, oral histories, and religious interpretation, ensuring that the memory of 1281 was understood not only as a historical event, but also as a lesson in strategy, preparation, and observation. Social structures were strengthened as a result of the invasions and the storm's intervention. Villagers and samurai shared responsibility for defense, integrating practical knowledge, observation, and coordination. Families preserved stories of ancestors who had participated in the defense, passing lessons of vigilance and responsibility through generations. Communities established communication networks, emergency systems, and patrol routines, ensuring that local knowledge could contribute to broader strategic defense. The shared experience of crisis and survival created lasting bonds between civilian and warrior populations, reinforcing the importance of cooperation and discipline in national life. Political governance continued to be informed by the memory of the invasions. The shogunate required regular reporting on troop readiness, fortification status, and resource availability. Coastal regions were inspected and evaluated, ensuring that standards of preparedness were maintained. Leaders who had demonstrated effective coordination were recognized and rewarded, while those who failed to meet expectations were subject to censure or reassignment. The storm's decisive role highlighted the importance of human leadership and organization. Preparation alone could not have repelled the Mongols without competent management and coordinated action. Education and training for future generations emphasized both practical skill and strategic awareness. Samurai were taught to anticipate enemy behavior, coordinate units, and adapt to environmental conditions, Villagers learned basic defensive measures, observation skills, and methods for reporting information. Drills simulated landings, supply disruptions, and adverse weather, reinforcing adaptability and disciplined response. Knowledge of tides, currents, and coastal geography was integrated into instruction, ensuring that future generations could combine observation with action to protect the islands. Religious and ceremonial practice continued to integrate historical memory and practical lessons. Shrines and temples commemorated the defense, emphasized gratitude and moral conduct, and reinforced social cohesion. Ritual observance provided a framework in which communities could reflect on past events, honor participants, and maintain preparedness. By embedding historical memory into spiritual practice, communities ensured that the lessons of vigilance, coordination, and observation would be preserved across generations. The storm that struck in 1281, often referred to later as the Kamikaze, had a profound and lasting impact on Japan. It destroyed much of the Mongol fleet approaching the western coast of Kyushu, saving the islands from invasion. Yet the full significance of the storm became clear only in the context of human preparation. The Kamakura shogunate, regional lords, samurai units, and local communities had all spent months organizing defenses, constructing fortifications, coordinating militias, and establishing communication systems along the coast. Without these preparations, the storm alone might not have been enough to prevent the Mongols from attempting landings in scattered locations, nor to ensure that the defenders could respond efficiently to any isolated successes by the enemy. In the weeks leading up to the storm, coastal communities had observed distant sails on the horizon and received reports from scouts and fishermen. Samurai leaders stationed at fortifications along Hakata Bay reviewed supply stocks, inspected walls and barriers, and coordinated patrols. Villagers contributed by transporting supplies, reinforcing barriers, and maintaining lookout posts along the shoreline. Observations of tides, currents, and wind patterns were used to anticipate likely points of attack, enabling defenders to position themselves strategically. Every hour of vigilance, every reinforced barrier, and every coordinated signal system played a role in ensuring that the islands were ready when the storm struck. The storm itself began as a series of high winds and heavy rains, striking the Mongol fleet when the ships were tightly packed and unprepared for such intense conditions. Contemporary observers reported that ships capsized, collided, or were driven ashore. Arrows, armor, and equipment from the fleet were carried onto beaches and into the shallow waters, and many soldiers drowned before reaching land. The chaos created by the storm prevented the Mongols from forming organized landing parties, and the surviving forces were scattered, disorganized, and unable to mount coordinated attacks. The storm acted as a force multiplier for the Japanese defenses, magnifying the effectiveness of walls, ditches, and armed patrols. The role of the storm gradually became central in historical narratives. Chroniclers documented the timing, intensity, and consequences of the winds and waves, noting the exact sequence in which Mongol vessels were destroyed. These accounts emphasized the relationship between human preparation and environmental factors. The samurai's positioning of troops, the villagers' vigilance, and the fortifications along the coast all contributed to ensuring that the storm's effects were decisive. Without this coordination, the fleet might have managed to land at scattered points, forcing defenders into difficult battles across multiple locations. The experience of surviving the invasion shaped coastal communities for decades. Families who had participated in the defense maintained traditions of vigilance, storing essential supplies and training younger generations in observation and communication. Fishermen continued to monitor winds, tides, and currents, interpreting changes as potential indicators of approaching threats. Communities developed formal systems for reporting unusual activity along the coast, establishing a routine of preparedness that became part of daily life. The memory of the storm reinforced these habits, highlighting the combination of natural forces and human effort that had preserved the islands. Political structures were reinforced as well. The Kamakura shogunate used the experience of the Mongol invasions to strengthen oversight of regional lords. Reports of troop readiness, supply availability, and fortification status were required regularly, and inspections were conducted to ensure compliance. Leaders who had effectively mobilized forces were rewarded with additional responsibility and recognition, while those who had failed to maintain readiness faced censure or reassignment. The storm demonstrated that even external forces beyond human control could only be fully advantageous when leadership and coordination were competent. Economically, the invasions prompted improvements in resource management and trade resilience. Ports and harbors damaged by the storm and enemy activity were repaired, and systems for storing food, weapons, and other essentials were reinforced. Merchants developed alternative routes and contingency plans to maintain trade during crises, while villages created reserves to ensure survival in the event of disruptions. The combination of environmental challenge and military threat encouraged long-term planning that strengthened local economies and allowed communities to recover more quickly from future disturbances. Cultural memory emphasized both human effort and the storm's decisive role. Chronicles such as the Azuma Kagami recorded the precise sequence of events, detailing troop deployments, fortification preparations, and environmental conditions. Oral histories recounted the courage of samurai, the cooperation of villagers, and the chaos of the Mongol fleet as it struggled against the storm. Over time, these narratives shaped a collective understanding in which the survival of Japan was seen as the result of both preparation and natural forces. The term Kamikaze became synonymous with divine intervention in later centuries, but contemporaneous accounts emphasized the interplay of human planning and environmental conditions. The Mongols, after losing much of their fleet to the storm, returned to Korea and China. Survivors reported the destruction, emphasizing both the strength of the natural forces and the preparedness of Japanese defenders. While the Mongol Empire remained vast and powerful, the failed invasion illustrated the limitations of even disciplined military forces when confronted with environmental hazards and organized local resistance. Japanese leaders studied these reports to understand enemy strategy, learning about Mongol formations, ship construction, and tactics, which informed future defensive planning. Military organization in Japan was permanently influenced by the invasions and the storm. Coastal fortifications were maintained and expanded, with ditches, walls, and watchtowers at strategic locations. Patrols became routine, ensuring that local populations and samurai units could respond rapidly to any potential threat. Coordination between professional warriors and local militias was institutionalized, creating a flexible system of defense in which both knowledge of terrain and observation of environmental conditions were essential. Drills simulated enemy landings, supply disruptions, and adverse weather, reinforcing lessons learned from 1281. Education for samurai emphasized observation, strategic thinking, and coordination. Young warriors learned to anticipate enemy movements, understand tides and winds, and respond to emergencies. Villagers were taught basic defense measures and communication methods, contributing to the collective security of their communities. Drills and exercises included environmental simulation, reflecting the understanding that natural forces could be decisive. This focus on practical and observational skills ensured that future generations were prepared for a range of contingencies, both human and environmental. Social structures were strengthened by the shared experience of the invasions. Cooperation between samurai and villagers became integral to community life. Stories of courage and vigilance were passed down through families, ensuring that lessons in preparedness and coordination remained part of cultural memory. Communities maintained systems for communication, emergency response, and mutual support, reinforcing cohesion and resilience. the storm of 1281 was remembered not only as a destructive force, but also as a moment in which human planning and environmental events combined to protect the islands. Religious and ceremonial practices reflected the memory of the storm and the defense. Shrines along the coast hosted rituals honoring those who had participated in the defense and encouraging gratitude for survival. Buddhist temples documented the events and offered prayers for continued protection. These practices reinforced social cohesion, providing moral and spiritual guidance while preserving historical memory. The integration of ritual with practical preparedness ensured that the lessons of 1281 were transmitted across generations, linking historical experience with communal values. The psychological impact of the invasions persisted for decades. Families recounted the tension and vigilance required during the approach of the fleet and the relief that followed the storm. Young people learned the importance of preparation, observation, and collective effort. The memory of the storm reinforced the idea that survival required both human action and awareness of natural forces. Communities internalized these lessons, creating a culture in which vigilance, coordination, and disciplined response were integral to daily life. Technological and tactical awareness expanded as a result of the invasions. Samurai and craftsmen studied Mongol ships, weapons, and armor, learning from the designs and tactics of the enemy. While Japan did not build a large navy, observations informed ship construction, defensive planning, and fortification techniques. Knowledge gained from the invasions was integrated into training, ensuring that future defensive measures incorporated lessons in both technology and strategy. The storm highlighted the vulnerability of even well-equipped forces to environmental hazards, reinforcing the importance of adaptation and observation. Economically, the emphasis on preparedness and resilience shaped local planning. Villages created reserves of food, weapons, and materials essential for survival. Trade networks incorporated contingency planning, ensuring continuity even during disruptions. The combination of military threat and environmental hazard demonstrated that stability depended on both physical resources and organizational capacity. Communities developed long-term strategies for resilience, integrating lessons from the invasion and the storm into their planning for future security. Following the catastrophic storm that scattered the Mongol fleet, the immediate aftermath in coastal regions of Kyushu was a mixture of relief, destruction, and careful rebuilding. The storm had wrought significant physical damage, washing ashore wrecked ships, splintered hulls, and supplies from the Mongol fleet. Many of these were scavenged by local villagers and samurai for practical use. The coastline was littered with debris, and in some areas, salt water had contaminated fields, requiring careful agricultural recovery. Villagers who had participated in emergency defenses now focused on restoring homes, repairing infrastructure, and rebuilding communal spaces that had been abandoned during the weeks of tension. Despite the relief, there was a profound understanding that the storm alone could not be relied upon for future defense. The Kamakura shogunate and local lords immediately began reviewing the lessons learned. Defensive fortifications that had been hastily erected before the invasion were inspected, repaired, and expanded. Walls and ditches along Hakata Bay were reinforced with stone and timber, and new watchtowers were constructed at points where gaps in surveillance had been noted. Commanders analyzed every strategic decision made before and during the Mongol approach, evaluating which troop placements were most effective and where coordination could be improved. The samurai who had fought along the coast became central figures in the organization of ongoing defenses. These veterans trained younger warriors, emphasizing not only martial skill but also the broader logistics of coastal defense. Patrol systems were formalized, integrating local militias of villagers who could observe the shoreline, report unusual activity, and provide assistance in times of crisis. Drills were conducted regularly, simulating enemy landings, sudden storms, and the coordination challenges that arose during the real invasion. observational skills, knowledge of tides and currents, and understanding of wind patterns became key components of military education. Villagers also learned the importance of preparedness and communication. During the invasion, ordinary citizens had assisted by maintaining supply routes, transporting reinforcements, and relaying signals from watchtowers to fortified positions. These efforts had been essential in ensuring that samurai could respond quickly to potential landings. After the storm, communities institutionalized these practices, creating structured observation posts, maintaining emergency supplies, and rehearsing coordinated responses. The shared responsibility of defense strengthened social cohesion and reinforced the understanding that survival required both organized action and awareness of the environment. The role of the storm gradually became central in historical accounts. Chroniclers recorded the precise sequence of events, the timing of the winds, the movement of waves, and the destruction of the Mongol fleet. Observations noted that ships caught in tight formations were particularly vulnerable, and that the survivors were unable to regroup effectively. Commanders' reports emphasized how the storm magnified the advantages provided by well-placed fortifications and organized patrols. In effect, the storm acted as a decisive force, but it was the human preparation that allowed this natural event to determine the outcome of the invasion. Politically, the invasions and the storm reinforced the authority of the Kamakura shogunate. Regional lords were required to maintain readiness at all times, with reports on troop deployment, fortification conditions, and supply management submitted regularly. Inspections ensured compliance, and effective leaders were recognized with rewards or additional responsibility, while those who had failed to prepare were held accountable. The experience demonstrated that competent governance and disciplined organization were essential, even when natural forces could intervene in favor of the defenders. Economically, the aftermath of the storm prompted careful planning and adaptation. Coastal towns had suffered disruption from both the approaching Mongol fleet and the storm itself. Ports and trade routes were repaired, and measures were taken to protect essential supplies from future threats. Villages developed storage systems for rice, salted fish, and other essentials, while merchants established contingency plans for trade in case of emergencies. The experience demonstrated that economic resilience depended on the combination of preparedness, redundancy, and coordination, lessons that informed local and regional planning for decades. The cultural memory of the invasions was preserved in chronicles, oral histories, and religious practices. Written accounts documented the sequence of events, the organization of defenses, and the storm's role in scattering the Mongol fleet. Oral histories emphasized the courage and coordination of samurai and villagers alike, transmitting lessons of vigilance and preparedness. Shrines and temples along the coast commemorated the defense, offering rituals that combined gratitude, reflection, and moral instruction. Over time, the storm became symbolic, remembered not simply as a natural occurrence, but as a decisive factor in the survival of the islands, when combined with disciplined preparation and organized defense. Military organization was permanently influenced by the lessons of 1281. Coastal fortifications were maintained and expanded, incorporating stone walls, ditches, and watchtowers at strategic locations. Patrol systems were formalized, integrating observation of environmental conditions with rapid response capabilities. Samurai were trained not only in combat, but also in coordination, communication, and logistical support. Local militias of villages were integrated into these systems, ensuring that human knowledge of terrain and environmental factors contributed directly to defense planning. Drills simulated emergency landings, sudden storms, and supply disruptions, reflecting the understanding that preparedness must account for both human and natural variables. Education for samurai incorporated observation, strategy, and environmental awareness. Young warriors were taught to anticipate enemy movements, recognize changes in wind and tide, and adapt to dynamic conditions. Villagers were educated in basic defensive practices, including observation and communication methods, ensuring that local knowledge contributed effectively to national defense. Exercises simulated realistic scenarios, combining military and environmental challenges to build adaptive and disciplined responses. The storm of 1281 became a reference point for understanding the interaction between preparation and circumstance, shaping training for generations. Social structures were reinforced by the shared experience of defense. Villagers who had assisted in the invasion were recognized for their contributions, strengthening bonds between civilian populations and samurai. Families preserved stories of courage, vigilance, and cooperation, ensuring that lessons were transmitted across generations. Communities institutionalized communication networks, patrol systems, and emergency procedures, creating a culture of preparedness and mutual responsibility. The storm's decisive role highlighted the importance of coordinated human effort, reinforcing values of discipline, observation, and cooperation. Religious practices integrated both historical memory and moral instruction. Shrines along the western coast commemorated the defense, emphasizing gratitude and reflection. Buddhist temples recorded events and provided guidance, framing the experience as both a moral lesson and a historical event. Rituals reinforced social cohesion, linking remembrance of the storm and invasion to practical guidance for vigilance and preparedness. This integration of ritual and history ensured that communities would continue to internalize lessons learned from the events of 1281. The psychological impact of the invasions persisted. Coastal families remembered the tension of the approaching fleet and the relief brought by the storm. Stories of vigilance, courage, and preparedness were repeated to younger generations, embedding the lessons into cultural memory. Young samurai and villagers internalized principles of observation, coordination, and adaptability, understanding that survival depended on both human effort and awareness of natural forces. The storm became a central reference for teaching strategy, preparedness, and the integration of environmental factors into decision-making. Technological and tactical awareness expanded after the invasions. Samurai and craftsmen studied Mongol ships, armor, and weapons, learning from enemy designs and formations. Observations informed improvements in Japanese fortifications, ship construction, and weapons. Even though Japan did not maintain a large centralized navy, knowledge gained from the invasions was applied in training and planning, ensuring that defenses could respond effectively to both human and environmental challenges. The storm highlighted the vulnerability of advanced forces to natural events, emphasizing the necessity of adaptability and observation. Economically, the emphasis on preparedness and resilience shaped long-term planning. Villages maintained reserves of essential supplies and developed systems for rapid distribution during crises. Trade networks incorporated contingency planning to ensure continuity during disruptions. The combined threat of invasion and environmental hazards demonstrated the importance of both resources and coordination. Communities adapted to these lessons, building sustainable practices for defense and survival that would influence economic planning for generations. The storm gradually emerged as the defining factor in Japan's survival. While human preparation, coordination, and fortifications had been essential, it was the storm's timing and intensity that prevented the Mongols from establishing a foothold on Japanese soil. Chroniclers emphasized the interaction of human effort and environmental conditions. The storm amplified the effectiveness of defenses, turning preparedness into decisive advantage. Over time, the storm became central to cultural memory, symbolizing both the destructive power of nature and the capacity of disciplined, organized society to benefit from it. In the months following the storm, the coastal regions of Kyushu remained in a state of cautious recovery. Villagers who had witnessed the approach of the Mongol fleet and the subsequent destruction caused by the storm were deeply aware of the vulnerability of their homes and livelihoods. Fields that had been flooded, or damaged by the high tides and storm surges were carefully reclaimed, and infrastructure that had been hastily repaired during the invasion was rebuilt more permanently. Timber and stone were used to reinforce walls, rebuild homes, and secure harbors. The debris from Mongol ships, including fragments of hulls, weapons, and supplies, was collected and repurposed by local communities, serving as both practical material and as tangible reminders of the threat that had passed. The samurai who had commanded fortifications and organized coastal defenses during the invasion became central figures in these reconstruction efforts. They trained younger warriors in the lessons learned from the Mongols, focusing on both combat readiness and logistical planning. Fortifications that had been sufficient for emergency defense were expanded, and watchtowers were rebuilt at vantage points that allowed better observation of the horizon and the surrounding coastline. Signals and flags that had been used during the invasion were improved for faster communication between posts. Observation became as important as direct combat ability, and the knowledge of currents, tides, and prevailing winds was integrated into defensive strategy. Villagers themselves took on responsibilities that were previously informal or ad hoc. Communities established structured systems for observing the coastline, noting unusual patterns in waves, wind, or approaching ships. Fishermen were particularly important in this process, as their intimate knowledge of tides and currents allowed them to recognize signs that might precede an enemy approach or a sudden storm. Families maintained emergency supplies, trained members in signaling and basic defensive action, and created networks to share information quickly. The storm had demonstrated that survival depended on both preparation and environmental awareness, and these practices became embedded in local life. The storm's impact was gradually recognized as the decisive factor in Japan's defense, but this recognition was always framed within the context of human preparation. Chroniclers and officials emphasized that the Mongols' destruction had been possible not merely because of the storm, but because Japanese forces were ready, vigilant, and strategically positioned. Walls, ditches, and fortified positions amplified the effects of the natural disaster, while coordinated patrols ensured that scattered survivors were met with resistance rather than opportunity. Reports from samurai commanders described how the storm disrupted enemy formations, prevented organized landings, and forced retreat, all while defenders were positioned to respond if any ships did reach the shore. Politically, the shogunate reinforced centralized authority using the lessons of the invasion. Regional lords were required to maintain ongoing readiness, with regular reports on troop strength, supply levels, and fortification status. Those who had demonstrated effective leadership during the crisis were rewarded with increased responsibilities or recognition, while those who failed to act were held accountable. The experience of 1281 strengthened the principle that competent leadership, structured organization, and disciplined oversight were critical to national defense. The storm's role highlighted the fragility of relying solely on chance. Human planning and preparedness were essential to capitalize on favorable circumstances. Economically, the post-invasion period prompted systematic improvements in resilience and resource management. Coastal towns rebuilt damaged infrastructure and reinforced storage facilities for essential goods. Trade networks were modified to include alternative routes and contingency measures to ensure continuity during crises. Villages established reserves of rice, salt, and other critical supplies to survive potential future disruptions. The combination of natural disaster and foreign threat had revealed the interconnectedness of security, economy, and community, encouraging planning that balanced immediate needs with long-term sustainability. Cultural memory of the storm and the invasions was preserved meticulously. Chronicles recorded the movements of the Mongol fleet, the organization of Japanese defenses, and the destructive effects of the storm. Oral histories passed down accounts of samurai courage, village cooperation, and the chaotic retreat of the Mongol forces. Over time, the storm became a symbol of decisive intervention, remembered as the event that made conquest impossible. Rituals at shrines and temples incorporated both gratitude and instruction, emphasizing vigilance, moral conduct, and the importance of preparation. Communities celebrated the survival of the islands while internalizing the practical lessons of defense and observation. Military organization was permanently influenced by these events. Fortifications along the western coast were maintained, expanded, and standardized. Watchtowers, ditches, and walls were positioned with careful attention to terrain, tides, and wind patterns. Patrols were institutionalized, integrating local knowledge and environmental observation with samurai strategy. Units trained not only in individual combat, but in coordination, signaling, and logistics. The storm had demonstrated that an environmental event could shape the outcome of conflict, and military training began to emphasize flexibility, adaptability, and rapid response to changing conditions. Education for samurai included practical observation, strategic reasoning, and coordination with civilian populations. Young warriors were trained to interpret environmental cues, anticipate enemy movements, and act decisively within a structured command. Villagers were instructed in basic observation, signaling, and logistical support. Drills simulated enemy landings, sudden storms, and supply disruptions, ensuring that training accounted for both human and natural challenges. The storm became a key case study, illustrating how preparedness and strategic placement could transform the impact of unforeseen forces. Social structures evolved as a result of these lessons. Communities reinforced the connection between civilian responsibility and national defense. Families retained memories of who had participated in emergency measures, creating traditions of recognition and storytelling. Villagers maintained organized communication networks and patrol systems, while cooperation between local militias and samurai units became formalized. The memory of the storm emphasized the interdependence of human action and environmental factors, embedding these lessons into the social fabric for generations. Religious and ceremonial practices reinforced historical memory and communal values. Shrines along the coast commemorated the defense and encouraged reflection on preparedness and gratitude. Buddhist temples recorded the events, framed moral instruction in their teachings, and offered guidance on vigilance and responsibility. Rituals provided occasions to remember the storm and the invasion, linking historical memory to social and spiritual practice. Communities integrated these observances into the rhythm of daily life, ensuring that lessons from 1281 would persist across generations. The psychological impact of the invasions endured for decades. Families passed down stories of tension, vigilance, and relief. Young samurai learned the value of observation, coordination, and disciplined response. Villagers internalized principles of mutual support, preparedness, and awareness of environmental conditions. The storm became a central example in teaching strategy, illustrating how human effort and circumstance could combine to determine the survival of communities and the nation. Technological and tactical awareness was enhanced through careful observation of the Mongols. Samurai studied ship construction, armor, and weapons, noting both advantages and vulnerabilities. Fortifications were modified to reflect these lessons, and defensive strategies incorporated knowledge of enemy formations. While Japan did not build a large centralized navy, information gained from the invasions influenced shipbuilding, fortification design, and training exercises. The storm highlighted the vulnerability of even disciplined and technologically advanced forces to environmental forces, reinforcing the importance of planning and adaptation. Economically, the long-term response emphasized resilience. Villages created reserves of food, water, and materials for survival during emergencies. Trade routes incorporated contingency plans, ensuring continuity in the face of disruption. The experience of invasion and storm highlighted the interdependence of security, resources, and community cohesion. Planning for potential threats became integrated into daily life, creating sustainable practices that would shape local economies for decades. Gradually, the storm's role was recognized as the decisive factor in Japan's survival. While human preparation, coordination, and fortified positions had been critical, it was the timing and intensity of the storm that dispersed the Mongol fleet, preventing any significant landing. Chroniclers emphasize the interaction between human planning and environmental forces. Preparedness amplified the impact of chance, turning an extraordinary natural event into a historical turning point. Over time, the storm became central in cultural memory, remembered not only for its destructive power, but also for the way it had saved the islands through the combination of natural forces and human action. In the aftermath of the storm, the full scope of destruction to the Mongol fleet was evident. Along the western coast of Kyushu, survivors waded through wreckage, noting the remnants of vessels, armor, and equipment scattered across beaches. The Mongol soldiers who had survived the waves were either captured by local forces or made their way back to Korea, unable to regroup or launch a coordinated landing. The storm had struck at the critical moment when the fleet was concentrated near Hakata Bay, magnifying its effect. Ships tightly packed in narrow channels capsized, while others were driven into shallow waters and reefs, breaking apart under the force of wind and waves. The timing of the storm, coinciding with the Mongols' closest approach to the fortified coast, made it an overwhelmingly decisive factor. Yet the storm alone does not tell the full story. Japanese defenses had been carefully prepared for months prior to the invasion. Samurai commanded fortified positions, coordinated patrols, and maintained vigilance along the coastline. Villagers transported supplies, reinforced barriers, and watched the horizon for signs of enemy ships. The fortifications built in advance, including ditches and wooden walls, were ready to resist landings in case any ships survived the storm. The combination of these preparations and the storm ensured that the Mongols could not establish a foothold. The storm, in effect, amplified the effectiveness of Japanese organization, turning human effort into decisive strategic advantage. The social and political effects of the invasion and the storm were profound. Coastal communities retained structures of preparedness, integrating vigilance, communication, and coordinated response into daily life. The Kamakura shogunate used the event to reinforce centralized authority, requiring regular reporting on troop readiness, fortifications, and supply stockpiles. Successful leaders were recognized and rewarded, while those who failed to maintain preparedness were held accountable. In this way, the lessons of the Mongol invasion were institutionalized. Human effort, organization, and leadership were shown to be essential complements to the extraordinary intervention of natural forces. Economically, the experience encouraged long-term resilience. Villages established stores of food, water, and other essential supplies. Trade networks adapted to include contingency planning, and ports were rebuilt to withstand both storms and potential future threats. The integration of environmental awareness, preparation, and community coordination ensured that future disruptions could be managed effectively. The lessons learned extended beyond defense to economic planning, reinforcing the interconnectedness of survival, resource management, and communal responsibility. Cultural memory preserved the story of the storm and the defense. Chronicles such as the Azuma Kagami detailed troop movements, fortifications, and environmental conditions. Oral histories emphasized the courage of samurai, the cooperation of villagers, and the sudden destruction of the Mongol fleet. Shrines and temples along the western coast commemorated the defense, integrating gratitude, moral reflection, and instruction on vigilance into ritual life. Over generations, the storm became a symbol of decisive protection, remembered not as an isolated miracle, but as an event whose effect was maximized by human preparation. Military practices were permanently influenced. Fortifications were maintained, expanded, and standardized. Watchtowers allowed early detection of approaching fleets. Patrols monitored the coast, and coordination with local militias was institutionalized. Samurai were trained not only in combat, but in communication, logistics, and observation. Exercises simulated enemy landings, storms, and supply challenges, reflecting the understanding that the environment itself could be as decisive as enemy action. The storm of 1281 became a central case study for strategy and defense planning, demonstrating the importance of anticipating both human and natural variables. Education for future samurai incorporated lessons in strategy, observation, and coordination with civilian populations. Young warriors were trained to anticipate enemy movements, read environmental cues, and act decisively within a structured command. Villagers learned basic defensive measures and signaling methods, ensuring that local knowledge contributed to national security. The combination of human preparation and awareness of environmental conditions became a core principle of military training. Social structures were strengthened by the shared experience of defense. Communities maintained networks of communication, emergency response systems, and coordinated patrols. Families passed down stories of courage, vigilance, and cooperation, embedding the lessons of 1281 into cultural memory. The storm emphasized the interdependence of human action and natural forces, reinforcing communal responsibility and discipline. Religious practices reinforced these lessons. Shrines and temples commemorated the defense and integrated moral guidance with historical record. Rituals emphasized vigilance, preparedness, and gratitude for survival. By embedding historical memory into spiritual practice, communities ensured that the lessons of the storm and the Mongol invasions were preserved across generations. Psychologically, the invasions and the storm instilled a lasting awareness of both vulnerability and resilience. Coastal families maintained heightened vigilance, and young samurai internalized principles of observation, coordination, and adaptability. Villagers recognized the importance of community and mutual responsibility. The storm became central in teaching strategy and preparedness, illustrating how human action and environmental forces combined to determine survival. Technologically, the Japanese learned from observing the Mongol fleet. Ship construction, armor, weapons, and tactical formations were studied carefully. Fortifications were improved based on observed vulnerabilities, and defensive planning incorporated knowledge of enemy strategies. Even without building a centralized navy, Japanese forces applied these insights in coastal defense, training, and organization. The storm demonstrated that even advanced, disciplined forces could be defeated by natural forces, highlighting the importance of adaptation and strategic observation. Economically, the long-term response emphasized redundancy, preparation, and resilience. Villages and towns maintained reserves of food and essential supplies. Trade networks were fortified against disruption, and infrastructure was rebuilt with consideration of environmental hazards. The experience of the storm reinforced the idea that survival required both human planning and the ability to withstand external forces. Ultimately, the storm of 1281 answered the question posed by our narrative: how did a storm save Japan from the Mongols? The answer is a combination of natural timing and human preparedness. The storm destroyed the Mongol fleet at the moment of their greatest vulnerability, preventing them from landing in force. However, without the organized defenses, fortifications, coordinated samurai units, and vigilant villagers, the storm might have been less decisive. Its power was amplified and made strategically effective by the readiness of those defending Japan. The island survived not purely by chance, nor purely by human effort, but by the interaction of both. In summary, the failed Mongol invasions of 1274 and 1281 had profound effects on Japan. Coastal communities were transformed, with vigilance, coordination, and observation becoming routine. The samurai institutionalized training in both combat and strategy, incorporating lessons from enemy tactics and environmental factors. Fortifications were strengthened, communication systems maintained, and logistical planning emphasized. Economically, villages and ports adapted for resilience, storing essential resources and preparing contingency measures. Religiously and culturally, the invasions and the storm were commemorated, embedding the lessons of preparedness, cooperation, and vigilance into Japanese society for generations. The storm, the so-called Kamikaze, became a symbol of decisive natural intervention, but its significance was inseparable from the human effort that maximized its effect. In this way, Japan survived the Mongol threat, shaping military, political, social, and cultural development for centuries to come. Thank you for listening to this story of history, strategy, and survival. If you enjoyed this exploration of how a storm saved Japan in 1281, make sure to subscribe for more calm historical narratives. Share it with others who enjoy thoughtful stories. And remember that history often shows us the remarkable interplay between human effort and the forces of nature.